When Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez challenged the quiet civilian contractor to settle their dispute with fists instead of words, he expected to teach a lesson about respect and military hierarchy. What he didn't expect was to wake up 3 hours later in the base medical facility with a concussion, 17 witnesses, and absolutely no memory of how a woman half his size had put him on the ground without breaking a sweat. But Rodriguez's humiliation was just the beginning. Before the sun set on Camp Lejeune that day, 15 of the Marine Corps' finest would learn that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who doesn't look like a threat at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Sarah Chen had the remarkable ability to become invisible in plain sight. At 28, she possessed the kind of understated presence that allowed her to move through crowded spaces without drawing attention. Her slight frame and unassuming demeanor creating the perfect camouflage for someone who preferred observation to interaction. When she arrived at Camp Lejeune on a humid Tuesday morning in September, carrying nothing but a worn leather messenger bag and a set of credentials that raised more questions than they answered, most of the Marines barely noticed her existence. The military installation sprawled across the North Carolina coastline like a small city, its buildings and training facilities designed to prepare some of America's finest warriors for combat operations around the globe. Established during World War II, Camp Lejeune had evolved into one of the Marine Corps' most important training centers, where elite units came to develop skills that couldn't be learned anywhere else. The base housed everything from amphibious assault specialists to cyber warfare experts, creating an environment where exceptional performance was considered baseline competency. Sarah's assignment paperwork bore the logo of Advanced Combat Systems Research, a private contractor that specialized in developing training protocols for military applications. Her job description was deliberately vague, something about biomechanical analysis of hand-to-hand combat effectiveness, which sounded impressive enough to grant her access to training facilities, while boring enough to discourage further inquiry. The administrative staff who processed her clearance assumed she was another Pentagon consultant, brought in to study Marine training methods and write reports that would disappear into bureaucratic filing systems. What they didn't know was that Dr. Sarah Chen held 3 black belts in different martial arts disciplines, had spent 2 years training with Shaolin monks in remote mountain monasteries, and possessed a doctoral degree in kinesiology that focused specifically on the biomechanics of human combat efficiency. Her research wasn't theoretical. It was deeply personal, driven by experiences that had shaped her understanding of violence, survival, and the deadly precision that separated true warriors from people who simply knew how to fight. The Marines at Camp Lejeune took pride in their physical conditioning and combat skills. These were men and women who had earned their place through rigorous training that weeded out anyone who couldn't meet the Corps' demanding standards. They ran obstacle courses in full gear, practiced marksmanship until they could hit targets in complete darkness, and engaged in hand-to-hand combat training that prepared them for the brutal realities of modern warfare. Sarah observed their morning physical training sessions from the sidelines, making notes in a small tablet while carefully studying their techniques, conditioning levels, and tactical approaches to unarmed combat. The Marines noticed her presence but dismissed her as another civilian researcher whose understanding of military life came from textbooks rather than experience. She was small, quiet, and clearly more comfortable with academic analysis than physical confrontation. During her first week on base, Sarah established a routine that kept her largely invisible to the day-to-day social dynamics that characterized military life. She arrived early each morning to observe training sessions, spent her afternoons reviewing footage in the research facility they had assigned to her use, and ate her meals alone while making detailed observations about Marine combat training methods. Her presence was noted but not considered significant by personnel who were accustomed to civilian contractors studying their operations for various military research projects. The Marines who worked most closely with her research were members of Bravo Company, 3rd Battalion, a unit that specialized in close-quarters combat and urban warfare operations. These were experienced fighters who had proven themselves in deployments around the world. Men and women whose confidence in their abilities was backed by real-world success in situations where competence meant survival. They viewed Sarah's research with the polite tolerance that professional soldiers showed civilian academics who studied military effectiveness from a safe distance. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez commanded the respect of every Marine and Bravo company through a combination of proven leadership, impressive physical capabilities, and the kind of aggressive confidence that characterized successful military careers. At 34, he stood 6 feet 2 inches tall with the heavily muscled build that came from years of intensive physical training combined with natural athletic ability. His arms were covered with tattoos that documented his service record, and his presence dominated any room he entered through sheer force of personality and demonstrated competence. Rodriguez had earned his stripes through deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, where his unit had been responsible for clearing buildings in urban combat environments that tested every aspect of their training. His hand-to-hand combat skills were legendary within the battalion, developed through years of practice with Marine Corps martial arts program techniques supplemented by boxing and mixed martial arts training he pursued during his off-duty hours. He had never met a civilian who could match his fighting ability, and he didn't expect that to change anytime soon. The other Marines in Bravo Company looked to Rodriguez for guidance not just in military matters, but in questions of respect and hierarchy that emerged when dealing with civilian contractors, whose presence sometimes felt like criticism of their methods. Rodriguez had made it clear that he welcomed legitimate research that could improve Marine combat effectiveness, but he had little patience for academics who thought they understood fighting without having been tested under real combat conditions. Corporal Jake Mitchell, Rodriguez's second-in-command, possessed the kind of nervous energy that made him eager to prove himself worthy of increased responsibility. At 26, he had completed 2 combat deployments and earned commendations for courage under fire, but he still felt the need to demonstrate his competence to senior personnel who would determine his advancement opportunities. Mitchell's approach to hand-to-hand combat emphasized speed and aggression, tactics that had served him well during military operations but reflected a style that prioritized overwhelming opponents through superior physical conditioning rather than technical sophistication. Lance Corporal Tony Washington brought a different perspective to Bravo Company's combat training. As a former college wrestler who had joined the Marines after graduation, Washington understood grappling techniques and ground fighting strategies that complemented the striking-focused training that dominated Marine martial arts instruction. His analytical approach to combat made him one of the unit's most effective teachers, capable of breaking down complex techniques into components that other Marines could understand and implement effectively. Private First Class Kevin Murphy represented the newest generation of Marines, young fighters whose confidence sometimes exceeded their experience but whose enthusiasm for training made them valuable assets during combat preparation. Murphy's background included amateur boxing experience that had taught him footwork and hand combinations, but he lacked the tactical sophistication that came from integrating different fighting disciplines into comprehensive combat strategies. These Marines formed the core group that Sarah observed most closely during her research, their training sessions providing data about Marine combat capabilities, while their interactions revealed social dynamics that influenced unit effectiveness. They were professional soldiers who took pride in their abilities, but they were also young men whose competitive nature sometimes led to conflicts that required resolution through unofficial means. Sarah's presence among them was tolerated rather than welcomed, accepted as a necessary inconvenience that came with modern military research requirements. They assumed she would complete her analysis, write her reports, and disappear back to whatever academic institution had sent her to study their methods. None of them imagined that the quiet woman taking notes on their fighting techniques possessed capabilities that would challenge everything they thought they understood about combat effectiveness and the relationship between size, strength, and actual fighting ability. The research facility where Sarah spent her afternoons was a converted warehouse equipped with video analysis equipment, biomechanical measurement devices, and computer systems capable of processing complex data about human movement and combat efficiency. The space was isolated from the main training areas, providing her with privacy to conduct analysis without interfering with normal military operations. But Sarah's real research went far beyond the official project described in her paperwork. She was studying Marine combat methods not to write academic papers, but to understand how conventional military training compared to the fighting disciplines she had mastered through years of intensive study with masters who understood violence as both art and science. Her observations were preparing her for confrontations she hoped would never come, But experience had taught her that hope was a poor substitute for preparedness when dealing with people who mistook quiet competence for weakness. The first 3 weeks of Sarah's assignment passed without incident. She observed, analyzed, and documented Marine training methods while maintaining the professional distance that characterized her interaction with military personnel. The Marines grew accustomed to her presence without developing any particular interest in her background or capabilities. She was simply another civilian contractor fulfilling research requirements that someone in the Pentagon had determined were necessary for improving military effectiveness. But beneath the surface of routine academic observation, tensions were building that would soon test whether Sarah's years of training had prepared her for the kind of confrontation that erupted when competitive warriors decided that respect had to be earned through demonstration rather than assumed through credentials. The quiet woman who seemed more comfortable with books than battles was about to discover that sometimes the greatest challenges came not from enemies, but from allies who couldn't imagine that true strength might be hidden behind an unassuming exterior. The first sign of trouble emerged during the 4th week of Sarah's assignment, when her research began requiring closer observation of actual combat training sessions. The biomechanical analysis she was conducting needed detailed measurements of force application, movement efficiency, and energy expenditure during realistic fighting scenarios. This meant positioning herself within the training areas where Marines practice their techniques, rather than observing from the comfortable distance she had maintained during her initial weeks on base. The combat training facility at Camp Lejeune was a converted aircraft hangar equipped with padded floors, heavy bags, grappling mats, and obstacle courses designed to simulate the kind of close-quarters environments where Marines might need to fight without weapons. The space buzzed with constant activity as different units rotated through training schedules that kept the facility operational from dawn until well past sunset. The sound of bodies hitting mats, fists connecting with heavy bags, and instructors shouting corrections created a symphony of controlled violence that reflected the serious business of preparing warriors for actual combat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah's new position within the training area meant she was no longer an invisible observer taking notes from the sidelines. She was physically present among Marines who were sweating, bleeding, and pushing their bodies to the limits of endurance while practicing techniques that could mean the difference between life and death in real combat situations. Her clinical detachment and academic focus began to feel inappropriate in an environment where everything was immediate, physical, and intensely personal. The Marines of Bravo Company had grown accustomed to her distant presence, but having her move among them with measuring devices and cameras changed the dynamic significantly. Rodriguez noticed the change first, his leadership instincts alerting him to the potential for distraction when his Marines became conscious of being studied up close by someone whose understanding of their profession came from textbooks rather than experience. During a particularly intensive grappling session, Sarah positioned herself near the mats, where Rodriguez was demonstrating submission techniques to newer Marines. Her tablet recorded force measurements and joint angle calculations, while her presence created a subtle but noticeable shift in the energy of the training session. Marines who had been focused entirely on learning and practicing techniques began showing off, attempting more spectacular throws and submissions than the situation required. Rodriguez recognized the phenomenon immediately. He had seen it happen before when civilian observers were present during training. Young Marines, especially those still proving themselves within the unit hierarchy, would attempt impressive techniques beyond their skill level, rather than focusing on fundamentals that would actually make them more effective fighters. The result was decreased training quality and increased risk of injury from poorly executed maneuvers. After the session ended, Rodriguez approached Sarah with the direct communication style that characterized his leadership approach. "Doc," he said, using the informal title the Marines applied to anyone with advanced education, "your research is important, but having you right in the middle of training is affecting my Marines' focus. They're performing for your cameras instead of concentrating on proper technique." Sarah looked up from her tablet with the kind of analytical attention she applied to all data, including social interactions that required navigation. "I understand your concern, Staff Sergeant. The biomechanical measurements I need require close proximity to capture accurate force vectors and movement patterns. Perhaps we could arrange specific sessions where your Marines could demonstrate techniques without the pressure of regular training requirements." The suggestion seemed reasonable on its surface, but Rodriguez heard something in Sarah's tone that bothered him. It was the same clinical detachment he had encountered from other civilian researchers who studied military operations without understanding the human realities that made those operations possible. She was treating his Marines like laboratory specimens, rather than recognizing them as professional warriors whose training served purposes that went beyond academic research. "These aren't demonstration sessions, Doc," Rodriguez replied, his voice carrying the edge that appeared when he felt his authority or his Marine's dignity was being questioned. "This is combat training. My Marines are preparing for situations where their lives and the lives of their teammates will depend on their ability to fight effectively. That's not something you can understand from measuring joint angles and calculating force vectors." The exchange was observed by several Marines who had finished their training and were preparing to leave the facility. Corporal Mitchell watched with particular interest, recognizing the subtle challenge in Rodriguez's tone and wondering how the civilian researcher would respond to criticism from someone whose authority was backed by proven combat experience. Sarah's response surprised everyone within hearing distance. Instead of backing down or becoming defensive, she met Rodriguez's gaze with calm confidence that suggested she wasn't intimidated by his physical presence or military rank. "You're absolutely right, Staff Sergeant. Academic analysis can only capture certain aspects of combat effectiveness. The variables that matter most in actual fighting situations are impossible to measure in laboratory conditions." The acknowledgement should have ended the conversation, but something in Sarah's delivery suggested she had more to say. Rodriguez waited, recognizing the pause that preceded statements which would shift the direction of a discussion. "However," Sarah continued, "the techniques I've observed during your training sessions contain inefficiencies that could be addressed through better understanding of biomechanical principles. Some of your Marines are expending unnecessary energy during grappling exchanges, creating openings that more experienced opponents would exploit." The comment struck the training facility like a physical blow. Rodriguez stared at Sarah with the expression of someone who couldn't believe what he had just heard. A civilian researcher with no apparent combat experience was suggesting that Marine training methods contained flaws that she could identify and correct through academic analysis. Mitchell stepped closer to the conversation with the protective instincts that Marines developed toward their unit leaders. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying respectful formality that barely concealed irritation, "with all due respect, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has been teaching hand-to-hand combat for over a decade. His techniques have been tested in actual combat situations where Marines' lives depended on their effectiveness." Sarah turned her attention to Mitchell with the same analytical focus she had shown Rodriguez. "I'm not questioning the Staff Sergeant's experience or the proven effectiveness of Marine combat training. I'm suggesting that academic analysis might identify opportunities for improvement that aren't apparent from within the training system itself." Washington had been listening to the exchange while toweling sweat from his wrestling session. His background in collegiate athletics had taught him to appreciate technical analysis that could improve performance, but he also understood the pride and tradition that made Marines resistant to suggestions from outsiders who hadn't proven themselves through shared hardship. "What kind of improvements are you talking about?" Washington asked, his curiosity overriding the tension that was building between Sarah and the unit leadership. Sarah consulted her tablet, pulling up data she had collected during the session. "Energy expenditure during ground fighting shows inefficient force application in approximately 40% of the grappling exchanges I've measured. Marines are using upper body strength to accomplish techniques that could be executed more effectively through leverage and proper body positioning." The technical language made her observations sound authoritative, but Rodriguez wasn't impressed by academic terminology when it was applied to skills he had developed through years of practical experience. "Doc, you can measure whatever angles and forces you want, but fighting isn't about efficiency. It's about imposing your will on someone who's trying to kill you. Sometimes that requires brute force rather than textbook technique." Murphy had joined the growing circle of Marines who were listening to the discussion with fascination. As the newest member of the unit, he was particularly interested in any conversation that might provide insights into improving his combat skills. "So you think our techniques are wrong?" he asked Sarah. "Not wrong," Sarah replied carefully, "but potentially improved through better understanding of the biomechanical principles that make techniques effective. For example, the armbar technique demonstrated earlier could generate significantly more force with less energy expenditure through modified hand positioning and hip angle adjustment. Rodriguez felt his patience reaching its limit. The conversation had evolved from legitimate research concerns into implicit criticism of training methods that had been developed through decades of combat experience and refined through practical application in actual warfare. Sarah's academic credentials might be impressive, but they didn't qualify her to suggest improvements to techniques that had been proven effective in life-or-death situations. "Tell you what, Doc," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the dangerous calm that preceded most confrontations. "Instead of talking about theoretical improvements, why don't you demonstrate these better techniques you've identified? Show us how your biomechanical analysis translates into actual combat effectiveness." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, creating the kind of charged silence that preceded either resolution or escalation. Sarah understood that Rodriguez was offering her an opportunity to prove her theories through practical demonstration, but she also recognized the underlying hostility that made the invitation more threatening than a genuine invitation to share knowledge. The Marines watching the exchange understood immediately that they were witnessing something more significant than academic disagreement. Rodriguez was challenging Sarah's credibility in the most direct way possible, offering her the chance to back up her theoretical knowledge with physical demonstration. In Marine culture, such challenges were rarely declined, without losing respect that was impossible to recover. Sarah looked around the circle of faces watching her response, calculating the social dynamics that would determine whether this moment became a learning opportunity or a confrontation that would make her continued research impossible. She could decline the challenge and accept the loss of credibility that would make her suggestions irrelevant to future training discussions. Or she could accept, knowing that her response would reveal capabilities she had hoped to keep concealed throughout her assignment. The decision would determine not just her relationship with Bravo Company, but whether her research could continue under the comfortable anonymity that had allowed her to observe Marine training methods without becoming personally involved in the social dynamics that governed military culture. Rodriguez's challenge had forced her to choose between academic distance and personal engagement, and Sarah realized that her response would change everything about her presence at Camp Lejeune. The quiet researcher who had spent weeks taking notes from the sidelines was about to discover whether her years of intensive training had prepared her for the kind of test that emerged, when theoretical knowledge met practical challenges in an environment where respect had to be earned rather than assumed. Sarah's response came after a pause that seemed to stretch across the training facility like a held breath. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quality that none of the Marines had heard before, a calm certainty that suggested she was prepared for exactly this kind of moment. "I'd be happy to demonstrate the biomechanical principles I've identified," she said, setting down her tablet and removing the lightweight jacket she wore over a plain black t-shirt. "However, I should mention that effective demonstration requires committed resistance. Academic corrections are only meaningful when applied against someone who's genuinely trying to prevent the technique from working." Rodriguez studied her with renewed interest. Sarah's acceptance of his challenge was unexpected enough, but her insistence on committed resistance suggested either dangerous overconfidence or knowledge that went beyond theoretical understanding. He had issued similar challenges to other civilian researchers over the years, and most had either declined immediately or attempted half-hearted demonstrations that proved their lack of practical experience. "Fair enough," Rodriguez replied. "Mitchell, get on the mat. Give the doc whatever resistance she thinks she needs to prove her point." Corporal Mitchell approached the center of the training mat with the confident stride of someone who had never been seriously challenged by a civilian. At 5 feet 11 inches and 200 pounds of muscle developed through years of intensive training, he possessed the kind of physical advantages that usually determined outcomes in hand-to-hand combat situations. His wrestling experience at the high school level had been supplemented by Marine combat training that emphasized practical techniques designed for battlefield effectiveness rather than sport competition. Sarah moved to the center of the mat with movements so economical they seemed almost casual. Her preparations were minimal: a brief stretch of her shoulders, a quick adjustment of her ponytail, and a few seconds spent studying Mitchell's stance and positioning. She appeared relaxed in a way that suggested either complete confidence or total ignorance of what she was about to attempt. The Marines gathered around the mat with the eager anticipation that characterized any event where unit pride was at stake. Washington positioned himself where he could observe the technical aspects of whatever Sarah was planning to demonstrate. Murphy pulled out his phone to record what he expected would be either an embarrassing failure or an unexpected learning opportunity. The facility's other occupants began drifting toward the demonstration area, drawn by the unusual sight of a civilian preparing to grapple with a Marine. "What technique are you planning to demonstrate?" Rodriguez asked, his question carrying both genuine curiosity and subtle challenge. "The armbar variation you demonstrated earlier," Sarah replied. "The biomechanical inefficiency I mentioned can be corrected through modified hand placement and hip positioning that generates approximately 30% more joint pressure while requiring 15% less energy expenditure." The technical precision of her response impressed Washington, whose analytical background allowed him to appreciate detailed breakdowns of technique modification. But precision in description didn't necessarily translate to effectiveness in application, especially when facing resistance from someone with Mitchell's size and experience advantages. Mitchell assumed the starting position that Rodriguez had used during his earlier demonstration, a defensive posture designed to make armbar attempts difficult while providing opportunities for counterattack if the technique failed. His stance was textbook Marine Corps, emphasizing balance and mobility while maintaining defensive awareness that would allow rapid response to threats from multiple angles. "Ready when you are, ma'am," Mitchell said, his tone respectful but confident. Sarah's initial movement was so subtle that several observers missed it entirely. She didn't explode into action or attempt the kind of dramatic technique that characterized movie fighting scenes. Instead, she made a small adjustment to her positioning that seemed insignificant until Mitchell found himself slightly off balance, without understanding why. The sequence that followed unfolded with the kind of fluid precision that came from thousands of hours of practice under conditions where mistakes had serious consequences. Sarah's hand placement was indeed different from the standard Marine technique. Her fingers positioned to create leverage advantages that weren't apparent until the technique was already in motion. Her hip positioning generated power through body mechanics rather than muscular force, allowing her to apply pressure that exceeded what Mitchell's size advantage should have made possible. But it was her timing that truly distinguished her technique from standard military instruction. Sarah didn't fight against Mitchell's resistance. She used it, redirecting his defensive energy in ways that actually increased the effectiveness of her attack. When he tried to prevent the armbar through conventional escape methods, his efforts only served to tighten the submission hold that was developing faster than his training had prepared him to recognize. Mitchell's experience with ground fighting told him something was wrong before his conscious mind understood what was happening. The armbar attempt felt different from any he had encountered during training or sparring sessions. The pressure was building more quickly than standard technique would allow, and his usual escape methods weren't providing the leverage he expected them to generate. Rodriguez watched the demonstration with growing professional interest. Sarah's technique contained elements he recognized from advanced martial arts instruction, but her application showed understanding that went beyond academic study. She was demonstrating biomechanical principles through practical application that achieved exactly the improvements she had described: greater force generation with less energy expenditure. Washington observed the hand positioning Sarah was using, noting details that explained why her technique was proving more effective than the standard Marine version. Her grip created mechanical advantages that multiplied the force she could apply, while her body positioning allowed her to maintain control even as Mitchell attempted to use his size advantage to escape the submission hold. The technique reached completion with Mitchell tapping the mat to signal submission, his face showing the confusion of someone who had been defeated by methods he didn't understand. The entire sequence had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it had demonstrated technical sophistication that exceeded anything the Marines had expected from civilian research. "Interesting," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying genuine respect for what he had witnessed. "That was definitely more efficient than our standard technique. Where did you learn that variation?" Sarah helped Mitchell to his feet before responding, her demeanor returning to the clinical professionalism that had characterized her previous interactions. "The principles are drawn from multiple martial arts disciplines. The hand positioning comes from Brazilian jiu-jitsu instruction, while the hip mechanics are based on judo techniques modified for maximum leverage efficiency." Mitchell rubbed his arm where the submission hold had been applied, his expression showing professional appreciation for technique that had been both effective and controlled. "That felt completely different from the armbars we practice. The pressure built up way faster than I expected." The modified grip creates a mechanical advantage that increases pressure application by approximately 30%, Sarah explained, falling back into the academic language that made her insights sound like textbook information rather than hard-won practical knowledge. The energy savings come from using body positioning to generate force rather than relying primarily on arm strength. Murphy had recorded the entire demonstration on his phone, and he immediately began replaying the sequence to study the technical details that had made Sarah's technique so effective. "Could you teach us that variation? It looks like it would be useful for situations where you need to control someone larger." The question opened possibilities that Sarah hadn't anticipated when she accepted Rodriguez's challenge. Her demonstration had been intended to prove the validity of her biomechanical analysis, but it had also revealed capabilities that would inevitably lead to requests for more comprehensive instruction. She could provide technical explanations for the modifications she had shown, but deeper instruction would require revealing training background that raised uncomfortable questions about her true qualifications for this research assignment. Rodriguez was studying Sarah with the expression of someone reassessing initial conclusions based on new information. Her demonstration had been impressive enough to command respect, but it had also revealed experience that went beyond the academic credentials listed in her personnel file. Marines with her level of technical knowledge typically earned that expertise through intensive training that left documented trails in military or law enforcement backgrounds. "That's definitely something we could incorporate into our training program," Rodriguez said carefully. "But I'm curious about where you developed those skills. The technique you demonstrated requires extensive practice to execute that smoothly under resistance." Sarah recognized the question as both professional inquiry and subtle interrogation. Rodriguez was asking for information about her background that would explain capabilities she had just demonstrated. Her response would need to provide enough detail to satisfy legitimate curiosity, while avoiding revelations that would compromise the carefully maintained anonymity that had allowed her to conduct research without personal complications. "I've studied various martial arts disciplines as part of my academic research," she replied, the answer technically accurate while avoiding details that would reveal the true extent of her training. Understanding biomechanical principles requires practical experience with their application. Washington approached the conversation with the analytical perspective that made him valuable during technical discussions. "What other techniques have you identified that could be improved through biomechanical modification? If you can make our arm bars 30% more effective, there might be other areas where similar improvements are possible." The question represented both opportunity and danger for Sarah. She could provide technical insights that would genuinely improve Marine combat training, potentially saving lives in future combat situations. But expanded instruction would require continued demonstration of abilities that would inevitably expose the true depth of her martial arts background and raise questions about her presence at Camp Lejeune that went beyond academic research. Rodriguez made the decision for her. "Doc, I think we need to arrange some extended sessions where you can share more of these biomechanical improvements with the entire unit. If your techniques can make my Marines more effective fighters, that's something we need to explore thoroughly." Sarah understood that her acceptance of Rodriguez's initial challenge had fundamentally changed her relationship with Bravo Company. She was no longer a distant observer conducting academic research. She had become a potential instructor whose knowledge could improve their combat effectiveness, but whose background remained mysterious in ways that would inevitably generate curiosity about her true qualifications and purpose at the base. The quiet researcher who had hoped to remain invisible while studying Marine training methods had accidentally revealed capabilities that would make anonymity impossible to maintain. Her demonstration had been successful beyond her intentions, proving not just the validity of her theoretical analysis, but also her practical ability to apply advanced fighting techniques under pressure. The consequences would extend far beyond a single technique demonstration, opening pathways that would either enhance Marine combat training or expose secrets she had hoped to keep hidden throughout her assignment. Word of Sarah's demonstration spread through Camp Lejeune with the speed that characterized military gossip when something genuinely unusual occurred. By evening chow, Marines from units across the base had heard various versions of the story about the civilian researcher who had submitted Corporal Mitchell using techniques that exceeded standard Marine training protocols. The details varied depending on who was telling the story, but the core facts remained consistent enough to generate widespread curiosity about Sarah's actual background and capabilities. Captain Daniel Morrison, commanding officer of Bravo Company, received the initial report from Rodriguez during their routine evening briefing. Morrison was a career Marine whose 20-year service record included multiple combat deployments and extensive experience managing personnel who possessed specialized skills that didn't always fit conventional military categories. His approach to leadership emphasized results over procedures, and he was more interested in what Sarah's knowledge could contribute to his Marine's effectiveness than in the bureaucratic complications her presence might create. Tell me about this demonstration, Morrison said, settling behind his desk with the focused attention he applied to any situation that might affect his unit's operational readiness. Rodriguez provided a detailed account of Sarah's armbar technique, emphasizing the measurable improvements in efficiency and effectiveness that her modifications had achieved. Sir, her technique was approximately 30% more effective than our standard approach, and she executed it against committed resistance from a Marine with significant grappling experience. This wasn't a lucky application against a cooperative training partner. Morrison absorbed the information with professional interest. Advanced Combat Systems Research had provided minimal details about Sarah's qualifications when they assigned her to study Marine training methods. But her demonstration suggested expertise that went beyond academic analysis. What's your assessment of her actual background? Academic researchers don't typically possess that level of practical fighting ability. Unknown, sir, Rodriguez replied honestly. Her personnel file contains standard civilian contractor information, but her technique demonstrated training that would require years of intensive practice under qualified instruction. She's either significantly underqualified for her research position or significantly overqualified for what we've been told about her background. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on Morrison's office door. Sergeant First Class David Park entered with the crisp bearing that characterized senior non-commissioned officers who had earned their positions through proven competence under pressure. Park commanded Alpha Company's hand-to-hand combat instruction program and had heard enough details about Sarah's demonstration to generate professional curiosity about her methods. Sir, Park said, addressing Morrison while nodding respectfully to Rodriguez, I've been hearing interesting reports about the civilian researcher's combat techniques. If she's identified improvements to standard Marine training methods, Alpha Company would benefit from exposure to her instruction. Morrison recognized the potential value of expanded training opportunities, but he also understood the complications that would arise if Sarah's background couldn't support the level of instruction that Marines were beginning to request. Park, what's your assessment of current hand-to-hand training effectiveness? Are there areas where improvement would provide significant operational benefits? Park had been evaluating Marine combat training for over a decade, and his experience included instruction of special operations personnel, whose mission requirements demanded superior fighting skills. Sir, our current techniques are effective for baseline combat situations, but there's always room for improvement in efficiency and energy conservation. If this researcher has identified methods that increase technique effectiveness by 30%, that represents a significant tactical advantage. Rodriguez found himself in the unusual position of advocating for expanded involvement from a civilian whose presence he had initially questioned. Sir, I recommend we arrange comprehensive evaluation sessions where she can demonstrate additional technique modifications. If her knowledge can improve Marine combat effectiveness, we have an obligation to explore that potential thoroughly. Morrison made his decision with the practical approach that had characterized his leadership throughout his career. Rodriguez, arrange extended training sessions with the researcher. I want detailed evaluation of any techniques she can demonstrate that exceed our current training standards. Park coordinates with Alpha Company to ensure we're collecting comprehensive data about potential improvements. The official approval for expanded training sessions created opportunities that Sarah hadn't anticipated when she accepted Rodriguez's initial challenge. Her successful demonstration had opened pathways for sharing knowledge that could genuinely improve Marine combat effectiveness. But it had also placed her in a position where continued instruction would require revealing capabilities that raised uncomfortable questions about her true background and purpose at Camp Lejeune. The news of officially sanctioned training sessions reached the enlisted Marines through the informal communication networks that carried information faster than official channels. Murphy shared details of Sarah's demonstration with his roommate Lance Corporal Brett Collins, whose background in mixed martial arts made him particularly interested in technique modifications that could improve fighting effectiveness. Collins had joined the Marines after a brief career as a professional fighter, and his experience with various martial arts disciplines allowed him to appreciate technical innovations that went beyond standard military instruction. You're telling me this civilian researcher submitted Mitchell using a technique that was 30% more effective than what we've been learning? That's what Rodriguez said, Murphy replied, and Morrison approved extended training sessions where she's going to demonstrate additional techniques. This could completely change how we approach hand-to-hand combat training. The enthusiasm was shared by Marines throughout the base who viewed expanded training opportunities as chances to improve skills that could prove essential during combat deployments. But not everyone was pleased by the developments surrounding Sarah's growing influence on Marine training programs. Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Blake commanded respect throughout Camp Lejeune through a combination of proven combat experience and unwavering dedication to traditional Marine training methods that had been tested through decades of successful military operations. Blake had earned his reputation during multiple deployments where his unit's combat effectiveness had been demonstrated under conditions where failure meant casualties among Marines whose lives depended on their training. Blake's approach to military instruction emphasized fundamentals that had been proven effective through extensive combat application rather than innovations that promised theoretical improvements but lacked validation through actual warfare. His philosophy was conservative by design. Marines' lives were too valuable to risk on unproven techniques that might fail under the stress and chaos that characterized real combat situations. When Blake heard about the planned expanded training sessions with Sarah, his reaction was immediate and negative. He approached Morrison's office with the determined stride of someone prepared to challenge decisions that he viewed as potentially dangerous to Marine welfare. "Sir," Blake said, presenting himself with the formal bearing that preceded serious disagreements with command decisions, "I have concerns about the expanded training program with the civilian researcher. Our current techniques have been proven effective through extensive combat application. Introducing modifications based on academic analysis could compromise training consistency that's essential for unit effectiveness." Morrison respected Blake's experience and valued his perspective on training matters that affected Marine combat readiness. "Gunny, what specific concerns do you have about evaluating potential technique improvements?" Blake's response reflected years of experience with training innovations that had promised improvements but failed to deliver results under actual combat conditions. "Sir, Marines train as teams using standardized techniques that ensure predictable coordination during combat operations. If we start modifying individual techniques based on academic analysis, we risk creating inconsistencies that could prove dangerous when Marines need to work together under pressure." The concern was legitimate and reflected understanding of combat realities that academic researchers might not fully appreciate. Marine units operated as integrated teams where individual effectiveness was less important than collective coordination that allowed multiple fighters to support each other during complex combat situations. Rodriguez joined the discussion with information that addressed Blake's concerns while supporting expanded evaluation of Sarah's techniques. "Gunny, the modifications she demonstrated improved technique effectiveness without changing fundamental application methods. Marines trained in her variations would still be compatible with standard techniques used by other unit members." Blake remained skeptical about innovations that hadn't been tested through combat application. "Staff Sergeant, how do we know these modifications will prove effective under actual combat stress? Academic improvements that work in controlled training environments don't always translate to success when Marines are fighting for their lives against enemies who aren't following academic principles." The debate reflected fundamental tension between innovation and tradition that characterized military institutions where proven methods competed with potential improvements that carried uncertain risks. Morrison understood both perspectives and recognized that his decision would affect not just training effectiveness, but also unit cohesion that depended on shared confidence in proven methods. "Gentlemen," Morrison said, applying the diplomatic approach that had made him effective in managing personnel conflicts throughout his career, "we'll proceed with limited evaluation sessions that test these techniques under controlled conditions. If they prove effective, we'll consider broader implementation. If they create problems, we'll maintain current training standards." The compromise satisfied immediate concerns while allowing evaluation of Sarah's techniques to proceed under conditions that would provide data about their actual effectiveness compared to standard Marine training methods. But the discussion had revealed underlying tensions about innovation versus tradition that would influence how Marines responded to expanded instruction from a civilian whose background remained mysterious. despite her demonstrated capabilities. Sarah learned about the brewing controversy through casual conversations with Marines who were eager to participate in expanded training sessions but uncertain about the institutional support for technique modifications that challenged established training protocols. She understood that her successful demonstration had created expectations that went beyond simple academic research, placing her in a position where she would need to prove that her innovations could improve Marine combat effectiveness without compromising the unit coordination that made Marine teams so effective in actual combat situations. The pressure was building toward a more comprehensive test of her abilities, one that would either establish her credibility as an instructor whose knowledge could genuinely improve Marine training, or expose her as an academic whose theoretical knowledge couldn't survive practical application under conditions that simulated actual combat stress. The quiet researcher who had hoped to remain invisible while studying Marine training methods was about to face the most challenging test of her career, proving that her years of intensive martial arts training had prepared her not just to fight effectively, but to teach others how to fight better than they had ever imagined possible. The expanded training session was scheduled for Friday afternoon in the main combat facility, with Marines from multiple companies invited to observe and participate in what had been officially designated as Advanced Biomechanical Combat Analysis. Sarah arrived early to prepare her demonstration materials, but she found the facility already occupied by a group that hadn't been part of the original planning. 15 Marines from the base's Elite Force Reconnaissance Unit stood in formation near the center mats, their presence commanding attention through the kind of physical conditioning and tactical bearing that separated special operations personnel from conventional military units. These weren't regular Marines interested in learning improved techniques. They were the best fighters Camp Lejeune had to offer, and their attendance suggested that Sarah's session had evolved beyond academic demonstration into something resembling a formal evaluation of her qualifications to instruct Marine personnel. Gunnery Sergeant Blake stood at the edge of the formation with the satisfied expression of someone whose strategic planning was proceeding according to design. His concerns about untested training modifications had led him to arrange what amounted to a comprehensive test of Sarah's abilities under conditions that would either prove her expertise or expose the limitations of academic knowledge when faced with superior military training and conditioning. Captain Morrison entered the facility with Colonel James Patterson, the base's commanding officer, whose presence indicated that Sarah's training session had attracted attention from the highest levels of Camp Lejeune's command structure. Patterson was a career Marine whose 30-year service record included command positions in every major military operation of the past 2 decades, and his interest in civilian training innovations reflected understanding that effective military organizations continuously evolved their methods based on the best available knowledge. Sarah observed the gathering crowd with professional assessment that cataloged both opportunities and threats represented by the expanded audience. Her original plan had involved demonstrating technique modifications to small groups of interested Marines who could evaluate their effectiveness through controlled practice sessions. Instead, she was facing what appeared to be a formal examination of her qualifications conducted by some of the most skilled fighters the Marine Corps had produced. Staff Sergeant Carlos Mendez approached Sarah with the respectful bearing that Force Reconnaissance Marines showed toward potential instructors, but his eyes carried the analytical assessment that Special Operations personnel applied to anyone claiming superior knowledge about subjects they had mastered through extensive training and real-world application. At 32, Mendez possessed the kind of comprehensive fighting skills that came from years of training in multiple martial arts disciplines, supplemented by combat experience in environments where hand-to-hand fighting was a matter of survival rather than sport. "Ma'am," Mendez said, his voice carrying the measured professionalism that characterized elite military units, "we understand you've identified improvements to standard Marine combat techniques. Force Recon would be interested in evaluating any innovations that could enhance our operational effectiveness." The statement was polite and professional, but Sarah recognized the underlying challenge. Force Reconnaissance Marines trained in advanced fighting techniques that exceeded standard Marine instruction, and their interest in her methods suggested they were prepared to test whether her academic knowledge could survive application against opponents whose skills represented the pinnacle of military combat training. Rodriguez joined the conversation with visible tension that reflected his growing concern about the direction the session was taking. His original intention had been to provide Sarah with opportunities to share useful technique modifications with Marines who could benefit from improved training methods. Instead, he was witnessing what appeared to be an arranged confrontation between a civilian researcher and the elite fighters, whose reputation was built on their ability to defeat any opponent they encountered. Staff Sergeant Mendez, Rodriguez said carefully, this session is designed for technique demonstration and analysis, rather than competitive evaluation. Dr. Chen's research focuses on biomechanical improvements that can be studied and implemented through collaborative training. Mendez nodded respectfully, but his response indicated that Force Reconnaissance had different expectations for the session. We understand, Staff Sergeant. However, technique effectiveness can only be properly evaluated through application against committed resistance from qualified opponents. Our participation will provide the kind of rigorous testing that validates training improvements for implementation across Marine units. Sarah realized that her situation had evolved beyond academic demonstration into something resembling a formal challenge match where her credibility would be determined through direct competition against Marines whose fighting abilities represented years of elite military training. She could decline the expanded evaluation and accept the limitation of her influence to theoretical analysis that carried no practical authority. Or she could accept the implicit challenge and demonstrate whether her years of intensive martial arts training had prepared her for confrontation against opponents whose skills exceeded anything she had previously encountered. Colonel Patterson approached the center of the facility with a commanding presence that drew attention from every Marine in the building. His decision to personally observe the session indicated that Sarah's evaluation had acquired significance that extended beyond routine training improvement into territory that could affect Marine Corps training doctrine across multiple installations. Ladies and gentlemen, Patterson announced, his voice carrying easily throughout the facility. Today's session represents an opportunity to evaluate potential improvements to Marine combat training through scientific analysis combined with practical demonstration. Dr. Chen's research has identified biomechanical modifications that could enhance the effectiveness of techniques we use to prepare Marines for combat operations. The formal introduction elevated the session's importance while placing additional pressure on Sarah to prove that her knowledge could survive scrutiny from the highest levels of Marine command. Patterson's presence confirmed that her demonstration would be evaluated not just for technical merit, but for its potential contribution to institution-wide training improvements that could affect thousands of Marines across multiple bases. Blake stepped forward with the expression of someone prepared to ensure that proper standards were maintained during the evaluation process. Sir, Force Reconnaissance has volunteered to provide qualified resistance that will test these techniques under conditions comparable to actual combat stress. Their participation will ensure that any training modifications we consider for implementation have been thoroughly validated through rigorous practical application. Sarah understood that Blake had orchestrated the expanded evaluation as a way to expose the limitations of her academic approach when faced with elite military opponents whose training exceeded standard Marine instruction. His strategy was sophisticated. By arranging for her to face Force Reconnaissance Marines, he was creating conditions where failure would discredit her methods, while success would require revealing capabilities that raised uncomfortable questions about her background. The 15 Force Recon Marines who had volunteered for the evaluation represented a comprehensive test of fighting skills across multiple disciplines. Mendez specialized in striking techniques developed through years of boxing and kickboxing training. Sergeant Michael Torres brought extensive Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu experience that made him particularly dangerous during ground fighting exchanges. Corporal Ryan Foster possessed wrestling credentials that had earned him placement on the Marine Corps competitive team before his assignment to Special Operations. Each Marine represented a different aspect of comprehensive fighting ability, and their collective presence suggested that Sarah would need to demonstrate proficiency across multiple martial arts disciplines if she hoped to prove the effectiveness of her training modifications. The evaluation had evolved into something resembling a martial arts tournament, where she would face opponents whose skills represented the best the Marine Corps had to offer. Sarah walked to the center of the facility with movements that appeared calm, despite her recognition that the session had become a test of capabilities she had hoped to keep concealed throughout her assignment. Her original research objectives had been accomplished through observation and limited demonstration, but the expanded evaluation would require revealing fighting skills that raised questions about her true background and qualifications for civilian contractor status. "Colonel Patterson," Sarah said, addressing the senior officer with respectful formality, "I appreciate the opportunity to demonstrate biomechanical improvements under rigorous conditions. However, I should mention that effective evaluation requires committed resistance that may result in techniques being applied with significant force. Academic demonstration becomes meaningless when participants are concerned about potential injury rather than focused on realistic application." Patterson nodded with understanding that came from extensive experience with training situations where realism required accepting risks that didn't exist in theoretical discussions. "Dr. Chen, these Marines are prepared for whatever level of resistance is necessary to properly evaluate your techniques. Force reconnaissance personnel train under conditions that simulate actual combat stress, and they understand that meaningful evaluation requires realistic application." The exchange had established parameters that made the session a legitimate test of fighting ability rather than academic demonstration. Sarah would be expected to prove her techniques through application against elite opponents who would provide the kind of resistance she would encounter in actual combat situations. Her performance would determine not just the validity of her biomechanical analysis, but her credibility as someone qualified to influence Marine training methods. Rodriguez watched the developing situation with growing concern about the direction the evaluation was taking. His original intention had been to provide Sarah with opportunities to share knowledge that could improve Marine combat training. Instead, he was witnessing what appeared to be an arranged test, where a civilian researcher would be expected to demonstrate fighting abilities against some of the most skilled combat personnel the military had produced. But Sarah's response to the escalating challenge suggested she was prepared for exactly this kind of confrontation. Her acceptance of the evaluation parameters carried the calm confidence that characterized people whose training had prepared them for situations where theoretical knowledge would be tested through practical application under conditions where failure carried serious consequences. The quiet researcher who had spent weeks observing Marine training methods from a distance was about to face the ultimate test of her credibility, proving that her years of intensive martial arts training had prepared her not just to understand fighting techniques, but to apply them effectively against opponents whose skills represented the pinnacle of military combat instruction. What happened next would determine whether Sarah Chen was truly qualified to teach Marines how to fight, or whether her academic credentials masked limitations that would be exposed when faced with elite military opponents who had dedicated their careers to mastering the art of combat. The formal evaluation began with Sergeant Michael Torres, whose Brazilian jiu-jitsu credentials made him Force Reconnaissance's most dangerous ground fighter. At 6 feet tall and 220 pounds of muscle developed through 8 years of intensive grappling training, Torres approached the center mat with the fluid movement that characterized elite grapplers who had transcended technical knowledge to achieve intuitive understanding of leverage, timing, and positional control. Sarah met him in the center of the facility, with movements so economical they seemed casual, but her positioning reflected tactical awareness that came from years of training under masters who understood combat as both physical and psychological warfare. She had removed her jacket and secured her hair, her plain black training clothes creating stark contrast with Torres's combat utilities adorned with Force Reconnaissance insignia that announced his elite status. "Ready when you are, ma'am," Torres said, assuming the kind of neutral stance that allowed rapid transition into either striking or grappling ranges depending on how the engagement developed. What followed was 15 minutes of controlled violence that redefined every assumption the assembled Marines had made about civilian capabilities and the relationship between size, strength, and actual fighting effectiveness. Sarah's approach to Torres was unlike anything the observers had seen during standard Marine training. She didn't attempt to match his strength or rely on techniques that required superior physical conditioning to succeed. Instead, she fought with principles that transformed Torres's advantages into disadvantages through tactical sophistication that exceeded military instruction. When he attempted takedowns that should have succeeded through superior size and wrestling experience, Sarah redirected his momentum in ways that left him off balance and vulnerable to counterattacks he couldn't see coming. When he tried to establish dominant positions during ground exchanges, she used leverage and timing to escape or reverse situations faster than his training had prepared him to counter. The first submission came after 3 minutes of grappling that demonstrated technical mastery beyond anything Torres had encountered during his military career. Sarah's execution of a modified triangle choke incorporated biomechanical principles that generated pressure through body positioning rather than muscular force. creating a submission hold that Torres couldn't escape despite his superior size and experience advantages. Colonel Patterson watched the exchange with professional fascination that reflected recognition of capabilities he had never seen demonstrated by civilian personnel. Sarah's technique wasn't just effective, it was educationally valuable, demonstrating principles that could improve Marine combat training if properly understood and implemented across training programs. Torres tapped out with the professional respect that elite fighters showed when they encountered superior technique, but his expression carried confusion about methods that had defeated him through approaches that weren't part of any military instruction he had received. "Ma'am, that triangle felt completely different from anything I've trained against. The pressure built up faster than standard technique should allow." Before Sarah could respond, Corporal Ryan Foster stepped onto the mat with the determined expression of someone whose wrestling credentials had never been seriously challenged by civilian opponents. Foster's background included 3 years of collegiate wrestling at the Division I level, supplemented by Marine combat training that emphasized takedown defense and ground control techniques designed for battlefield application rather than sport competition. The second engagement lasted 4 minutes and ended with Foster unconscious from a rear naked choke that Sarah had applied with mechanical precision that left no opportunity for escape or counterattack. Her approach to the wrestling specialist revealed an understanding of grappling that went beyond individual technique mastery into comprehensive tactical systems that allowed her to control the flow of combat through superior positioning and timing. Rodriguez watched the demonstrations with growing awareness that Sarah's capabilities exceeded anything he had imagined possible from academic research. Her victories weren't lucky applications of theoretical knowledge. They represented practical mastery of fighting principles that had been tested against elite military opponents under conditions that simulated actual combat stress. The third Marine to face Sarah was Staff Sergeant Carlos Mendez, whose striking skills represented years of boxing and kickboxing training, refined through force reconnaissance instruction that emphasized practical application under extreme stress. Mendez approached the engagement with tactical awareness that came from combat experience in environments where hand-to-hand fighting had been necessary for mission success and personal survival. Sarah's response to Mendez demonstrated striking abilities that matched her grappling expertise, but her approach to stand-up fighting revealed training that went beyond conventional martial arts instruction. She moved with the kind of fluid precision that characterized traditional fighting systems, where technique had been refined through centuries of practical application, her strikes generating power through body mechanics that maximized impact while minimizing energy expenditure. The engagement lasted 6 minutes and ended with Mendez on the ground from a palm strike to the solar plexus that had been delivered with surgical precision, followed by a takedown that transitioned seamlessly into a submission hold that forced his immediate surrender. Sarah's combination of striking and grappling skills demonstrated comprehensive fighting ability that exceeded specialization in individual disciplines. As the demonstrations continued, a pattern emerged that shocked the assembled Marines while validating Sarah's biomechanical analysis through practical application that couldn't be disputed. Each Force Reconnaissance Marine possessed elite skills in specific fighting disciplines. But Sarah's comprehensive training allowed her to exploit the gaps between their specializations through tactical approaches that neutralized their individual advantages. Lance Corporal James Wright, whose background in Muay Thai had made him Force Recon's most feared striker, found himself submitted through techniques that used his aggressive striking style against him. Sergeant David Kim, whose judo credentials had earned him respect throughout the special operations community, was defeated through ground fighting that incorporated principles he recognized but couldn't counter effectively. The crowd of observing Marines grew silent as the demonstrations progressed, their initial skepticism replaced by stunned recognition that they were witnessing fighting abilities that exceeded anything they had encountered during their military careers. Sarah wasn't just defeating elite opponents. She was making their defeats look effortless through technical superiority that transformed every engagement into an educational demonstration of biomechanical principles applied under realistic combat conditions. By the 10th opponent, word had spread throughout Camp Lejeune that something extraordinary was happening in the main combat facility. Marines from across the base had begun gathering to witness demonstrations that were redefining their understanding of civilian capabilities and the relationship between academic knowledge and practical fighting effectiveness. Gunnery Sergeant Blake watched the proceedings with the expression of someone whose strategic planning had produced unexpected results. His intention had been to expose the limitations of Sarah's academic approach when faced with elite military opponents, but instead he was witnessing comprehensive validation of capabilities that raised fundamental questions about her background and qualifications for civilian contractor status. Captain Morrison found himself documenting the session through detailed notes that would need to be included in official reports about potential training improvements identified through scientific analysis. Sarah's demonstrations were providing measurable data about technique effectiveness that could justify implementation of biomechanical modifications across marine training programs. But they were also revealing capabilities that exceeded reasonable expectations for civilian research personnel. The 15th and final opponent was Master Sergeant Robert Chen, Force Reconnaissance's senior instructor whose 20-year career had included training in virtually every fighting discipline the military utilized. Chen's approach to the engagement reflected a comprehensive understanding of Sarah's demonstrated capabilities, and his strategy incorporated lessons learned from observing the previous 14 defeats. But Sarah's response to Chen demonstrated why her training had prepared her for exactly this kind of comprehensive evaluation. Her technique adapted to his tactical modifications, while maintaining the biomechanical efficiency that had characterized all her previous demonstrations. The final engagement lasted 8 minutes and ended with Chen unconscious from a blood choke that had been applied with the kind of technical precision that characterized surgical procedures rather than combat techniques. When the demonstrations concluded, Sarah stood in the center of the facility surrounded by 15 unconscious or semi-conscious Force Reconnaissance Marines, her breathing steady and her appearance relatively unchanged, despite having engaged in continuous combat for over an hour. The assembled observers stared in stunned silence at a display of fighting ability that exceeded anything they had imagined possible from civilian personnel. Colonel Patterson approached Sarah with the expression of someone whose understanding of military capability had been fundamentally altered by what he had witnessed. "Dr. Chen," he said, his voice carrying respect that hadn't been present during his earlier interactions, "those demonstrations represent the most comprehensive validation of training effectiveness I've encountered during my career. Your techniques didn't just prove superior to our standard methods, they demonstrated fighting ability that exceeds our elite personnel." Sarah accepted the recognition with professional composure that masked her relief at having successfully navigated the evaluation without revealing more about her background than necessary. Her demonstrations had proven the effectiveness of biomechanical training modifications while establishing her credibility as someone qualified to influence Marine combat instruction, but they had also exposed capabilities that would inevitably generate questions about her true qualifications and purpose at Camp Lejeune. He and the quiet researcher who had hoped to remain invisible while studying Marine training methods, had just defeated 15 of the Marine Corps' most elite fighters, using only one hand for the final 5 opponents. A demonstration of superior technique that would become legendary throughout the military, while opening pathways for sharing knowledge that could revolutionize how the world's most powerful armed forces prepared their personnel for combat operations. The aftermath of Sarah's demonstration created a silence in the combat facility that was broken only by the groans of recovering Force Reconnaissance Marines and the whispered conversations of observers who were struggling to process what they had witnessed. Colonel Patterson stood at the center of the facility with the expression of someone whose understanding of military capability had been fundamentally altered by events that exceeded his 3 decades of experience with elite personnel and advanced training systems. "Dr. Chen," Patterson said, his voice carrying authority that demanded answers to questions that could no longer be avoided, "your demonstration has revealed capabilities that require explanation beyond academic research credentials. The techniques you've displayed suggest training that goes far beyond civilian contractor qualifications." Sarah understood that her comprehensive defeat of 15 elite Marines had created a situation where continued deflection was impossible. Her cover as a simple academic researcher had been shattered by displays of fighting ability that raised legitimate questions about her background, qualifications, and true purpose at Camp Lejeune. The time for careful anonymity had ended with her decision to accept the ultimate challenge, and now she faced consequences that would either provide opportunities for genuine contribution to Marine training or expose secrets she had hoped to protect. "Sir," Sarah replied, her voice maintaining professional composure despite recognition that her response would determine the future direction of her relationship with the Marine Corps, "my background includes training that wasn't detailed in the standard contractor documentation provided for this research assignment." The careful phrasing acknowledged Patterson's concerns while avoiding specific revelations that could compromise security protocols, but the colonel's expression indicated that vague explanations would no longer satisfy legitimate command curiosity about personnel whose capabilities exceeded reasonable expectations for civilian researchers. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached the conversation with notebook in hand, his role as primary liaison requiring him to document developments that would need to be included in official reports about the evaluation session. "Ma'am, the techniques you demonstrated today represent significant improvements over standard Marine training methods. If we're going to implement these biomechanical modifications across our programs, we'll need detailed instruction that explains the principles behind their effectiveness." Sarah recognized the opportunity that Rodriguez was offering, a chance to contribute genuinely valuable knowledge to Marine combat training while potentially avoiding deeper investigation of her background. Her demonstrations had proven the effectiveness of biomechanical training principles, and the Marines' eagerness to learn suggested possibilities for sharing knowledge that could save lives during future combat operations. Master Sergeant Chen approached the group with the measured stride of someone whose professional pride had been challenged by capabilities he hadn't expected to encounter from civilian personnel. Despite his defeat, his expression carried respect for superior technique combined with curiosity about training methods that had produced fighting abilities beyond anything he had experienced during his military career. "Dr. Chen," the Master Sergeant said, using the formal title that acknowledged her academic credentials while recognizing her demonstrated martial expertise, "your fighting principles represent comprehensive integration of multiple disciplines that we don't currently teach in any single program. How did you develop this systematic approach to biomechanical combat effectiveness?" The question struck at the heart of Sarah's dilemma. Providing an honest explanation would require revealing training background that raised uncomfortable questions about her true qualifications. But avoiding detailed answers would limit her ability to share knowledge that could genuinely improve Marine combat capabilities. Sarah's response came after careful consideration of how much truth she could reveal without compromising the security protocols that had protected her identity throughout her assignment. "My training incorporated traditional martial arts instruction with modern biomechanical analysis under masters who understood fighting as both physical science and tactical art. The integration required years of study in environments where theoretical knowledge was constantly tested through practical application." Colonel Patterson recognized the diplomatic nature of her explanation, while appreciating the technical sophistication it implied. "Dr. Chen, regardless of how you acquired these capabilities, your demonstration has proven their value for improving Marine combat training. I'm authorizing comprehensive instruction programs where you can share these biomechanical principles with personnel across multiple units." The authorization represented both opportunity and challenge for Sarah. She could contribute valuable knowledge to Marine training while potentially avoiding deeper investigation of her background. But expanded instruction would require revealing additional capabilities that might eventually expose secrets she preferred to protect. Gunnery Sergeant Blake found himself in the unexpected position of advocating for training innovations he had originally opposed. His strategic plan to expose the limitations of academic analysis had instead revealed capabilities that exceeded elite military training, forcing him to acknowledge that traditional methods could be improved through approaches he hadn't previously considered valuable. "Sir," Blake said, addressing Patterson with respectful formality that acknowledged command authority, "Dr. Chen's techniques represent genuine improvements that could enhance Marine combat effectiveness across all specializations. Her demonstrations proved that biomechanical modifications can increase technique efficiency without compromising the unit coordination that makes Marine teams effective." The endorsement from Blake carried significant weight due to his reputation as a guardian of traditional training methods and his initial skepticism about civilian innovations. His support for Sarah's instruction programs indicated that her demonstrations had overcome institutional resistance to change, while proving the value of scientific approaches to combat training improvement. Captain Morrison approached the discussion with practical questions about implementation that reflected his responsibility for ensuring that training innovations translated into improved unit effectiveness. "Dr. Chen, how quickly can we develop a curriculum that incorporates your biomechanical principles into existing training programs? My Marines need instruction that improves their combat capabilities without disrupting established team coordination protocols." Sarah appreciated Morrison's focus on practical implementation rather than theoretical analysis, recognizing that successful integration of her techniques would require careful attention to how individual improvements affected unit-level effectiveness. The principles can be integrated incrementally through modification of existing techniques, rather than replacement of established methods. This approach preserves team coordination while improving individual efficiency. The weeks that followed Sarah's demonstration transformed her role at Camp Lejeune, from civilian researcher to official combat instructor, with authority that extended across multiple units and training programs. Her office was relocated to the Advanced Training Complex, where she could access facilities designed for elite instruction, and her security clearance was upgraded to accommodate expanded responsibilities that required access to classified training methods and operational requirements. Sarah's instruction programs incorporated biomechanical principles through systematic modification of existing marine techniques rather than introduction of entirely new fighting systems. Her approach preserved the unit coordination that made Marine teams effective while improving individual capabilities through enhanced efficiency and energy conservation that could prove decisive during extended combat operations. The Marines who participated in her expanded training programs discovered that biomechanical improvements could significantly enhance their fighting effectiveness without requiring abandonment of techniques they had mastered through years of intensive practice. Sarah's instruction focused on modification rather than replacement, allowing Marines to improve their existing skills rather than starting over with unfamiliar methods. Rodriguez found himself serving as primary coordinator for Sarah's instruction programs, his role expanding to include evaluation of biomechanical training effectiveness across multiple units and specializations. His reports documented measurable improvements in Marine combat capabilities that justified continued expansion of Sarah's influence throughout Camp Lejeune and eventually other Marine installations. 6 months after her demonstration against 15 Force Reconnaissance Marines, Sarah received official recognition through appointment as Director of Advanced Biomechanical Combat Training, a position created specifically to formalize her contributions to Marine Corps instruction and expand her influence to include personnel development across all branches of the military. Her office overlooked the same training facility where she had first demonstrated her capabilities to skeptical Marines who had dismissed her as an academic whose understanding of combat came from textbooks rather than experience. The transformation from invisible researcher to recognized authority represented vindication of knowledge gained through years of intensive training under masters who understood violence as both art and science. The framed photograph on Sarah's desk showed her with the 15 Force Reconnaissance Marines she had defeated during her evaluation, taken 6 months later during the graduation ceremony for the first class of instructors trained in biomechanical combat principles. The Marines who had initially challenged her credibility had become her most effective advocates for training innovations that were revolutionizing military combat instruction. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, now promoted to Gunnery Sergeant and serving as Sarah's primary assistant, entered her office with reports documenting the effectiveness of biomechanical training programs that had been implemented across 12 military installations. Ma'am, the latest data shows 35% improvement in combat effectiveness metrics across all units that have completed your training programs. Sarah accepted the reports with professional satisfaction that reflected recognition of goals achieved through years of preparation and careful application of knowledge gained through intensive study with masters who had dedicated their lives to understanding the principles that separated effective fighters from those who simply knew techniques. The quiet woman who had been challenged to prove her worth through physical demonstration had transformed military combat training through biomechanical innovations that enhanced Marine effectiveness while preserving the unit coordination that made their teams legendary. Her journey from dismissed civilian researcher to recognized authority represented more than personal vindication. It embodied institutional evolution that recognized excellence regardless of how it was packaged or where it originated. The Marines who had once questioned her presence among elite fighters now sought her instruction with the respect that warriors showed toward masters whose knowledge had been proven through practical application under conditions where theoretical understanding was tested against reality. Sarah Chen had earned her place among them not through credentials or connections, but through demonstration of capabilities that exceeded their highest expectations, while contributing knowledge that made them better fighters and more effective protectors of the freedoms they had sworn to defend. The story of the civilian researcher who defeated 15 Marines with one hand became legend throughout the military, but more importantly, it became the foundation for training innovations that would protect future generations of warriors through biomechanical principles that transformed theoretical knowledge into practical advantage when their lives depended on fighting effectiveness that exceeded anything their enemies could imagine or counter. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.